Make every night a wonderful journey, no matter where you are. Here is your harbor of the soul. Good night, sweet dreams. The first story, The Janitor's Key. One day, a kid got what he thought was a genius idea. He'd find a way to stay overnight in his school just to be able to say he did it. The idea of the story, that it would make thrilled him, he had no idea how right he was. The major problem of the plan was getting a key. He couldn't just hide in corners the whole night. He wanted to explore. He also wanted to scope out the best places in the school for some after-school activities with any girls interested. He began to think of himself as the king of the brick castle that he spent most of his time in. He just needed that key. The only people that he thought would have a key to the entire school would be the janitors. They kept their keys on them, and had a spare set in their break room he went in during lunch. When the janitors were on cafeteria patrol, he came into the break room and picked up the keys. He'd figure out what they were for later. As he was walking out of the room, amazed that it actually worked, he walked right into one of the janitors. "What are you doing back here?" inquired the custodian. The kid stammered for a few seconds, and ultimately decided to tell the truth. There was something about the man that said, "You can trust me." The janitor laughed and said, "You know, I wanted to do the same thing when I was young. Something about having the whole place to myself. It was an intoxicating urge. I made the mistake of going to the top, thinking I could get the keys there. I got caught, and the old man expelled me, for lack of a better word. Then he took a key off of his key ring and gave it to the kid. It was an odd key. He couldn't properly tell what color it was. It seemed to keep changing. Even when he held it still, that key would open any door in the school for you enjoy. Son." He thought that he caught a whiff of something odd coming from the janitor, but thought nothing of it. The guy did clean up after teenagers for a living after all. That night, the kid came out of the corner that he was hiding in. He told his parents that he was sleeping over at his friend's house. He promised the friend a tour of the school in exchange for covering for him. He went through the school, finding out what teachers kept in their desks, playing with chemicals and fire in the chemistry room, and generally enjoying himself. He had no problems getting into any of the room's desks, or even locker. She had to use a flashlight instead of turning on the lights. But that just heightened the thrill. When it was around 3 o'clock in the morning, he decided to call it a night and sleep in the janitor's break room. He brought an alarm clock so that he could wake up in time to make his perfect escape. But if he was to be found by anyone, it would mean he would never be able to do this again. Plus, if he was caught by the janitor, he didn't think he would get in as much trouble. He woke up early. He heard some thumping, but couldn't tell where from. It sounded like footsteps. The smell that came off of the janitor permeated the air. The kid thought it smelled familiar, but couldn't place it. He turned on his flashlight. He pointed it around, and the beam fell on a figure in the corner. The kid let out a yell and dropped the flashlight. It went out as he was picking up the flashlight and preparing to run to beat the devil. He realized that he hung up his coat in that corner. "Dumbass," he said to himself, now that the flashlight was out. He noticed that it was a little brighter morning already. No, a glance at the clock told him that it was little over an hour after he fell asleep. So what was making it brighter? He felt his way out of the office until he was in familiar territory. He took his hands off of the walls, now walking fairly confidently. It seemed to be getting even brighter. Then it occurred to him if the figure in the corner was his coat. What made that thumping noise? He stopped and looked behind him. He saw a shadowy outline behind him. It was wearing his coat, even though he couldn't see the face. He knew that the figure was smiling. He ran like hell, aimlessly turning until he reached a stairwell. He went down it. Funny, he didn't remember there being a downward stairwell there. He thought he was on the first floor. Too late to turn back no as he ran down. It got brighter, and the faint odor he detected was getting stronger when he noticed the light flickering like a fire. He placed the smell sulfur. He looked around him and noticed the walls. They looked like cave walls, without rooms covering them. He saw the end of the stairs and the figure at the bottom waiting for him. The janitor looked up at him, smiled. The second story. Aggie, children are fascinating creatures. I can't help but marvel at the way they act and think. Their minds are molded so easily, so effortlessly, like the softest of dough in the strongest of hands. I worry that I will never understand this child, though, and how she thought. These things drifted through my head as I examined the dimly lit room. The doors and windows were taped off with crime scene ribbon, the sticky messes on the floor being sampled by a forensics team. The sight before me was grisly. What was once an 8-year-old lay on the ground. One wouldn't be able to tell what she was just by looking. Her head was hardly attached, if only by the spinal column. It lolled grotesquely to the side. The syrupy liquid coagulated after all these hours, when I was missing from the skull and sitting a few feet away. There was a gap where her stomach used to be, as if bitten through by a beast. Innards lay strewn about her, like a party popper on New Year's. Ghastly slash marks on her tiny wrists, hands, and fingers, crusted with blood and shredded bodily tissue, most likely from who or what was after her. Clearly something wanted her dead. Her parents were in similar conditions. A mother, a father, and a grandmother, all strewn about the living room. The place was a bloodbath. It made my stomach turn. It was clear that there was a struggle. Toys, dolls, puppet, and blocks were flung about the place, as well as magazines and broken glass. The living room looked like nightmare fuel. I gagged at the smell of blood and insides. They had to be at least 3 days old. It was becoming too much. Dizzily, I turned and walked away from the scene. Perhaps somewhere else in the house would be easier to stomach. I found myself upstairs once my days passed. From the looks of it, I was in the child's room. No sign of a struggle. All was peaceful, and everything was in place except one thing. A notebook, a little school notebook, lay open on the floor. I plucked it from the ground, turning it over in my hand. I nearly dropped it out of shock. Crusty, bloody lettering covered it. Symbols, signals, and signs. As signs, a face was scrawled on the paper. On almost every page, a stitched up, twisted face. The eyes were blacked out with tiny lines through them, like buttons. It looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. A small piece of paper fluttered out of the pages and landed on the floor. I knelt and picked it up. Don't you fear, my child. I'll keep the ghouls away. I'll keep you safe at night. I'll be your friend by day. But when it comes to friends, I have very few. So please don't leave me, darling, or my heart will be torn into. This didn't seem quite right. I turned the paper over and read the back. Madame Zo's worried all's your friend. Till the end. How strange. I paged through the book again, starting at the beginning. It looked like any normal diary. Little things were written about friends at school, conflicts with parents. The one thing caught my eye. Grandma got me a doll for my birthday. It's nice, I guess, but scary Mom said I couldn't give it away. I don't want it though. A few pages later was a similar entry. I keep Grandma's doll in the drawer. I don't like its eyes. It stares at me at night. That's creepy. There were several more like this. The doll watches me wherever I go now. Its head turns. None of my other toys have come alive before. It's weird but neat. I named my doll Aggies. Yes, not so bad. She told me today that we're going to be friends. Aggie doesn't like my mom or dad or grandma. I don't know why, maybe because they think I play with her too much. The entries became more and more disturbing as I read them. Aggie made me mad today. She called my mom bad things. She wouldn't stop talking. So I ripped off her eyes. He didn't like that. I said sorry later. Aggie is my best friend. I love Aggie. I hate my parents. After the last entry, there was nothing but scribble and symbols. It chill struck my spine. I felt acid or vomit rising in my throat. Something was terribly wrong. I had been in the room for hours and hadn't realized it. Hastily, I made my way downstairs as quickly as I could. The house was empty. The investigators were no longer there. All that was left was puddles of blood and the mess. The bodies had been removed already. I glanced around the room, my eyes skimming over anything that could mean something. She did this to herself, you know. I nearly shit myself at the sound of the hollow female voice. It sounded like it was right next to me, old and ancient. I spun around, looking for the source, and halted abruptly as they passed the doll I had seen earlier. One of its button eyes were gone. No, impossible. The voice came again. She did it to herself. There was no movement anywhere, but the sound came from the direction of the dolls. I felt crazy for doing it, but I spoke. Aggie? Yes, the voice replied, almost pleased that I was speaking to her. That was it. I couldn't hold it anymore. I vomited. This was far too much for me to handle. Oh, dear, she said to me. Poor thing, come and sit down, you. Ray not feeling well. What the fuck? I choked, swearing to God I was having a dream. Regardless, I did it to herself. What did she do to herself? Who? Yes, the girls. He did it to herself. I saw the whole thing. Yelled her family. One at a time. Granny was first to go. She used her own little hands. The doll's head lolled over to the side, as if someone pushed it. Ripped them apart. Then herself, she tore out her own eye. You know, I saw it. Then she ripped her own throat. It's an amazing thing. Possession before she even knew it. She had torn open her insides like a gutted fish. That's what she gets. The little bitch. I couldn't believe what was happening. I was being spoken to by a fucking puppet. A doll. A toy was talking and moving. A fucking plaything just described to me a terrible murder. It was horrifying, but alluring. I had to be crazy. I had to, but I moved closer to listen and to ask. Why? I said, my eyebrows furrowing in confusion. The doll simply shook her head. Shut on. T ask it. It'll be okay. A rush of hot air filled my head. My mind was suddenly blank. My eyes were drooping and tired. I was losing control. My hands suddenly lifted and made their way to the front of my shirt, fingers gripping at my flesh. It hurt, but I didn't want to stop. Don't tell my secret, Aggie whispered to me. All I did was nod. My nails began digging into my skin. Blood began trickling, appearing through my shirt within seconds. My fingers were embedded into my flesh, the first two knuckles sinking in the warmth. It hurt. I was on fire. No, I started, unable to control my movements. No, my flesh was tearing. the muscles rending into. She had me completely, as I felt the pressure of my organs pressing against the muscle and membranes. This was it. I couldn't stop. The third story. The shoe tree. Are we there yet? Words every father expects to hear invariably. At every 10-minute interval, my 8-year-old daughter Cynthia would peel her face from the car window and ask the same question, and dutifully, I would respond, almost, sweetie. We had been driving for almost 2 hours, which should give you an idea of how much I'd had to put up with to drop Cynthia off at her mother's. Lisa and I had been divorced for about 3 years, and doggedly, she still demanded to see Cynthia for a month every Christmas. Now, Lisa wasn't exactly Mother of the Year material, but hell, I'm no angel myself. I'm 37, I smoke, and have a nasty penchant for cursing like a sailor, but damn it, I love Cynthia, and it still kills me every time I drop her off for that dreaded month of December. Needless to say, I was in no hurry to get to Lisa's, so this year, I decided to take an old backwards route. I figured it would be a good chance to show Cynthia the beauty of nature, while squeezing out a little bit more time with her before I had to leave her for 4.5 weeks. She was so engrossed by the passing scenery that she would only ask the periodic "Daddy, what's that?" or "Are we there yet?" before replacing her round little face on the passenger side window, and I would indulge her every question, explaining, "It's an old grain silo, sweetheart, or almost a deer." After a while, I flicked on the radio for some quiet background noise and began to slip into the quiet, meditative trance induced by long-distance driving. However, my calm was soon disturbed by a shriek from Cynthia slamming on the brakes instinctively. I brought the car to a lurching halt, looking over at Cynthia. "What is it, Cynthia? What's wrong?" I asked. Panicking, my mind raced with all the things that could go wrong. Heart attack, pulmonary edema, kidney failure, all of which were outlandish, seeing as Cynthia was perfectly healthy. But Cynthia just kept staring out the window, transfixed by whatever was out there. As I looked past her small, childlike head, I began to see what had elicited the shrill scream. It was an enormous white birch tree in the middle of a snowy field. Now, aside from the unusually large size of the tree, birches don't usually grow much bigger than a foot in diameter. This one had to be at least 4 or 5. Something else struck me as odd about the leaves of the tree. It was a good distance into the field, about 30 yards, and I was still looking from behind Cynthia's head, which was firmly plastered to the window at this point, but I could just barely make out the shape of the leaves themselves. It didn't even register at first, but after looking carefully, I realized that the leaves of the tree weren't leaves at all. They were shoes, hundreds of them, hanging from the branches by the laces, every shape and size imaginable. I slowly opened the door and stepped out to get a closer look. The sheer size of the tree was impressive, and the spread of its branches was unbelievable by a rough sizing up. I guessed there to be about 600 or 700 pairs hanging all in all, some from even the smallest branches. I began to walk around the front of the car, unable to take my eyes off the bizarre spectacle before me. Then, without warning, I heard the other door open, and Cynthia shot off toward the tree, giggling with childish laughter. Now, aside from the fact that this was a field in the middle of nowhere, it was also the dead of winter, so as Cynthia ran off toward the tree, wearing just a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, my first reaction was to go get her coat. Lord knows she wouldn't put it on, even if it was 50 below. I turned around to grab her snow jacket from the car, and when I turned back, coat in hand, to yell as Cynthia to where he was gone. My eyes searched the snow frantically for her, tracing her footsteps directly to the tree's base. "Cynthia," I called. I heard a girlish giggle in response. "Cynthia, we don't have time to play games." I took a step towards the tree, and as the snow crunched underfoot, I heard her giggle again, unmistakable. "Cynthia, come here right this instant," I shouted, my voice becoming slightly more hoarse. To my immense relief, she revealed herself, dashing out from behind the shoe tree, but there was something off about her, something I couldn't quite put my... She was barefoot. "Fine, Daddy. I'm here. Do we have to go? The tree is so warm and nice." I grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her small frame, nearly trembling from fear. "Cynthia, where are your shoes?" Nervously, she answered. "The nice man told me to take them off. Daddy, look. He gave me a pretty necklace." My heart sank to the pit of my stomach. Sure enough, there, around my daughter's neck, was a small heart-shaped pendant. I clenched my jaw, grabbed the pendant, and snapped it off. "Daddy?" "What's wrong?" "Cynthia, I need you to get back in the car, and stay there, now." "But Daddy," my SHO-NOW. "Cynthia, get in the car, and lock the doors down. Do open them for anyone, until I tell you so, okay?" "Okay, if you say so." Cynthia walked off nervously towards the car, throwing glances back at me over her shoulder. I watched every step she took until she finally got in and locked the doors. Then I turned to confront this nice man. Whatever sick fuck set up this little sideshow attraction, I wasn't about to allow him to go around luring little kids in with cheap baubles just so he could get his rocks off. I followed Cynthia's tracks straight toward the tree, until it loomed before me, larger than life. It was then that I noticed something about the shoes. They were all children's, not a single pair larger than a kid's size 7. I shuddered and placed my hand on the tree for support. To my shock, it was warm to the touch. I peeled back some of the papery bark to get a closer look at what might be causing this phenomenon, and was surprised to see what looked like initials carved in. Now, that wouldn't have been terribly unusual, were it not for the fact that right next to those initials were and next to those, even more as I peeled back more and more of the thin, waxy bark, I discovered dozens of initials carved in, then hundreds. I took a step back. I began to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach, the twisting, wrenching knot that forms when you know something's wrong. I glanced back up at the shoes, and the knot tightened. I saw Cynthia's sneakers dangling there, like tiny little cadavers, dangling languidly by their lace tendrils. Thoroughly creeped the fuck out at this point, I turned and ran the fuck back to the car, my breath forming heavy clouds in the sharp, cold air. I grabbed my key and locked the driver's side door, got in, and locked it behind me. I turned to Cynthia and asked her, "Are you okay, sweetie? Did anyone hurt you or touch you?" "No. No, Daddy. I'm fine. Mrs. Miles is funny. He makes me laugh. He has got a funny face." That knot in my stomach twisted and squeezed, sending icy tendrils of fear creeping up toward my heart. Was Mrs. Miles Cynthia? Cynthia remained wordless as her eyes slid to the backseat. My heart froze solid as I slowly turned my gaze to follow her as it lounged casually back there. Only barely human bony talons, clasped neatly together, protruded from underneath the rotting flesh of its fingers. Its funny face, was a mass of decaying skin, stretched tight over its bleached white skull. The corners of its mouth had sloughed away, leaving only a sickening grimace permanently etched beneath its eyeless sockets. The grotesque smile widened, and it reached into a jar at its side, grasping a tiny piece of candy between its decrepit fingers. Ever a piece of candy. I stared, frozen with terror, as Cynthia's hand reached out and snatched the candy from its clutches and began unwrapping it. The creature's eyeless gaze seemed to shift to meet my own horrified stare, its disgusting grin widening ever so slightly. I tried to scream, but curiously found that I couldn't. Funny, I hadn't even noticed his other hand creeping up my neck. A creeping chill entered my veins as his icy talons clutched my throat. Warm blood spilled down my chest as my last breaths wheezed through the freshly torn hole in my neck. Cynthia looked at me curiously, suckling innocently on that piece of candy. Her voice echoed around me as I spiraled down into darkness. "Daddy? What's wrong? Daddy, Daddy?"